Wayne,
Steve?
we've got the great Howie Rose.
This is a new low for you guys. And for me.
That's right before we went on. That's what Howie said.
And first thing he said when he walked in.
First thing he said is, "This a new low for you guys."
So you blew my cover already.
Well,
That's supposed to sound like an ad lib.
No, I thought typical Howie, being very humble.
A script play-by-play around here.
that he threw it in, threw the little jab in. This is going to be, well, I don't know if you can see. It looks like it dried already. If you're watching on TV right now, right before we came on, I spilled water all over myself.
Well, that was supposed to be an ad lib too. You're really blowing it for everybody.
How is that supposed to be an ad lib?
Trust me, after this open, nobody's watching.
Wayne, I usually start these things off, but this is your partner. This is Howie
Rose
here. So
it's Howie Rose.
Go ahead. You started off.
In your wildest imagination, could you ever
You're talking to him or me?
You.
Oh.
That
I've got a wild imagination.
you would be where you are. What's today? August, whatever today.
With you two kumquats?
Today, yeah, August 23rd.
On a podcast.
Yeah.
When you started your broadcasting career.
I wouldn't call it my wildest imagination. I'd call it a nightmare that I might have had. But no, I had no idea. I'm not a visionary, so I couldn't look ahead X number of years and imagine how everything would expand in terms of platforms and the ability to get your message out. But it's cool. I love it.
You did reporting, you were a talk show host, and you've become a play-by-play guy now for a long time. Which was the path you wanted? Was there anything that you wanted? That was it all the time?
Play-by-play. I fell into doing a talk show. I'd always sort of fantasized about doing one. That'd be kind of cool, but it's nothing I really set my mind towards. But it happened serendipitously because when I was the sports director at WHN Radio, which was a country music station, and being the sports director at a country music station is kind of like being the captain of a rowboat. It looks good on a business card, but it's not the most responsible position in the world, but it sounded good, and I was doing morning sports. And then the company that bought WHN, MS Broadcasting, and this is back in mid-1980s, they were hell-bent on creating the first all-sports radio station. And so I was fortunate enough to be held over when WHN morphed into WFAN. By then I had been doing the Mets pre- and post-game shows, Mets Extra, and they also gave me the 7 to midnight talk show host job with no experience as a talk show host whatsoever other than Mets Extra, which was in its first year too. So they took quite a chance, to be honest with you.
That's 5 hours to fill.
Oh, it certainly was. Yeah, that was tough. 5 hours.
Right now, it's hard to imagine a sports landscape, a media landscape without sports talk radio, without 24/7 sports talk. But at the time, as exciting as I'm sure it was for you to be given that platform, did you think that that would succeed? Did you think that something like WFAN could work?
I thought that it could, but the entire first year that we were on the air, I would show up and turn around to see if they were padlocking the door, because they made so many mistakes that first year in terms of who they hired. And not because they were bad people or anything like that, but a wonderful guy who I'm told was actually the prototype for the Lou Grant character, a guy by the name of John Channon, just a lovely man. Was very loyal to a lot of people that he worked with when he ran ABC Radio Network Sports. And he brought a lot of them over to WFAN, basically to do updates and some of them to do talk shows, but they were just so out of their element. They didn't know New York. We didn't sound like New York. They're talking about college football and stuff that, at least at that time, but especially then, nobody in New York cared a rat's tail about. And I remember I had a producer when I was doing one of those 7 to midnight shows who's all excited. He goes, "Hey, I got you Bobby Cremins tonight." He was the basketball coach at Georgia Tech. And it's like July or August. I'm saying, are you out of your mind? Bobby, who in the heck wants to hear from the Georgia Tech basketball coach in New York in the middle of a baseball season when we got the Mets and the Yankees having, pretty good years, and plus everything else inherent in New York sports, football training camp starting and all that. Are you nuts? And those were the kinds of mistakes that we made for way too long, but thankfully we survived them.
Was there any difficulty for you as a talk show host, doing the Mets Extra and having to be, negative and critiquing the ball club, and then transitioning into a play-by-play guy not long after that, to then having to be someone who's in a way promoting the team through the broadcast?
It's a miracle I'm here right now in the role that I am. That, as you just described it, was torture. It really was. It was walking a tightrope every single day because, as you say, you have certain responsibilities, and I ended up getting into some hot water because of it, that are predicated on being true to your audience. You know, they're not listening to hear an apologist. They're not listening to hear a cheerleader. They're listening to hear what's going on. So my approach from the very beginning was that I was going to be, in effect, a beat reporter, just like a beat writer. And I had a daily conversation, pregame show with Davey Johnson, who was the manager of the Mets then. And I, again, had to decide right away that my line of questioning could be no different than what the beat writers would ask him. Otherwise, I'd be laughed out of town because not a whole lot of people knew who I was at that point. And that was a little difficult for Davey at the beginning. You know, he really tried to steer me away from that line of thinking, but eventually the light bulb went off and he saw that it would be a great opportunity for him, with all these people calling in and criticizing his every move, to explain himself, and he gave me free rein. And then we got somewhat friendly and comfortable with each other, to the point where I learned so much baseball from that man. I don't know that I'd be in the role I'm in today if I didn't have the opportunity to talk to him every night for those 3 years and a couple of months that he was the Mets manager while I was doing that show.
You know, Wayne started this by asking if you could have ever imagined on August 23rd, 2019, you'd be sitting here doing a podcast with us. But the thing, and we asked Gary Cohen this last year too, that I always think about with the two of you is you guys have been diehard fans of this franchise from day one. And like you said, it was always play-by-play for you. This was the job. This was the life you wanted.
Play-by-play. I mean, this and other stuff.
Right.
You know, the Rangers were every bit the dream job that this is.
Sure, and you also obviously got to do that as well.
Yeah.
But now, when you're only doing Mets, do you still have moments where you sit there on a warm summer night and you step up to the mic and it hits you that you've accomplished, you're living the life that 8-year-old boy, 9-year-old boy dreamt about?
Only every day. And I'm not trying to be glib. That's the absolute truth. And, you know, Wayne understands this because when we moved to Citi Field, and it took a while before we found the right one, I said, I have to have a picture of Lindsey Nelson, Bob Murphy, and Ralph Kiner in our booth. It's got to be a big one. It's got to be something that allows me on a night, and last night, as we taped this today, was a perfect example. We had rain delays that totaled over 3 hours, and it's nights like that, or it's games that drag on in seasons where you might be out of contention and you're playing meaningless baseball for the last couple of years. Those are the nights when you really have to discipline yourself not to lose track of what you're doing and how fortunate you are. And when that picture serves for me, is the opportunity to take a look at them, and it's a holy smokes moment, because I just stare at that picture, sometimes not for much more than a second or two, but it recalibrates me and it resets me, and it takes me back to when those guys were in my eyes and ears for 7-8 months of the year. And so I don't need much of a reminder to understand how incredibly blessed and fortunate I am to be doing this, and for this team.
I know you worked alongside Ralph and Bob a little bit. You ever meet Lindsey?
I met him, but I couldn't tell you that I knew him. I did maybe 1 or 2 interviews with him, and he was, the last couple of times I saw him, he was not in great health either.
Did Ralph and Bob have an appreciation or an understanding of what they meant for you and for Gary?
They were both so humble that they wouldn't really let you expound upon it too much, but they did. Oh, they absolutely did. I mean, when you're around someone who had the impact on me that those two did, it's impossible to hide it. You know, it's almost like when you're an adolescent, you're in high school or you're in college or whatever, and you're pursuing the pretty girl and you act a little goofy and different around her and stuff like that. I kind of felt that way with Bob and Ralph too, because I get it. I mean, I get what they meant, and still do to this day, even after they're gone, to this franchise and to the fan base, and again, to not only myself, but to Gary.
Do you have an understanding that you're that now? Like, does that ever occur to you?
Well, it does, because people say that now and then, and it sends shivers down my spine, really. It's the one button you could push that would make me really emotional. Because I've had people come up to me who are, the scary part of it is now, because I hold nothing back. I don't lie or exaggerate anything about my age. I mean, I'm 65 years old, so I get it that there are people now who, since I've been with the Mets in one capacity or another, since 1987, that's 32 years, and yeah, I get there are some people who have grown up with me stuck in their ears. And when somebody comes along and says, as they occasionally do, you know, you are to me and my generation what Bob Murphy was to yours, I got to take a step back because I could lose it. That's really the nicest thing anybody could say to me in this business.
I mean, listen, I've told you that before. I'm not trying to make you emotional, but I still have moments where.
You're going to go full Barbara Walters here? You're going to do a nice tight close-up?
See how he said
I'm
before,
I'm not going. I'm not breaking.
This has to be fun.
Yeah.
And now we're getting deep. But I've told you this before where.
Dry eyes, baby.
To me, you're one of those guys to me, especially because of my Rangers background as well that we connect over. You know, I have moments where I sit there and I can't believe I was a 7-year-old listening to your Mateau call over and over and over again. And well, you're the one that mentioned your age.
I understand.
You know, and even I had this little radio, and I think I might have told you this, but I had this little radio that I went to sleep with that was, I mean, it was a really old radio where you could, literally the only station, it was the only station I wanted to listen to, but the only one that I could really get on the dial was FAN. And I'd go to sleep every night listening to you know, Mets Extra. And so I still have my moments where I'm like, you know, I'm talking to Howie Rose like a friend now.
You are.
This is crazy.
It's only me, you know.
Is it difficult at all for you to I mean, I don't want to say difficult, but you're such an approachable, humble guy. And for someone who's had this level of success and notoriety in the business, in this market, I'd say that's somewhat rare. Has it, you know, is it just natural for you?
I don't know. I think you're influenced by the people around you growing up, obviously, and not only in the business, but my parents were very humble, decent, good people, and they would not have stood for me being anything else. I was raised professionally by Marv Albert, who was just one of the great people, never mind great broadcasters of all time, and was just such a huge influence on me because of his willingness to allow a little pain in the neck like me to pester him. You know, I would call him, he'd get off the air at WHN, and I'm 13, 14 years old. He'd be off the air 10 seconds and that phone would be ringing in the newsroom if I wanted to ask him a question or just talk to him. I was the president of his fan club, beginning in 1967 when I was 13 years old. This could, even for all I know, be the exact anniversary of the date when it happened, because it was late August. It was one of those kind of bridge weeks between summer and school, and we're sitting around not doing a whole lot, and I said to a few of my friends who were in my room with me, hey, let's start a fan club for Marv Albert. And I go, okay. You know, I mean, they were on board because it was something to do, but for me it was a passion. And so through that, you know, Marv got to see that I had serious intentions about this business. And as I got older and I stayed connected with him, he would listen to my tapes and give me really constructive criticism. He wouldn't just say, yeah, this is good, keep it going. He would say, you know, why would he question me? Why would you do this? Or maybe you could do this differently. And believe me, his word was the gospel. And so he only had to tell me once. And, you know, you can't put a price on that kind of instruction, or commitment's kind of a big word for something like that, but as one could be committed to helping me get better from the position he was in, he was every bit committed, and I'll never forget that.
What's the best piece of broadcasting advice you got, either from Marv or maybe it was from somebody else?
Become a salesman. No, I don't know that I ever got any particular piece of advice, because nobody was going to deter me from pursuing what I wanted to do. I'll tell you the best little piece of instruction that I ever got in terms of transitioning from radio to television when I did in the mid-1990s, when I went to Sports Channel, which was to do the Islanders and, as it turned out, the Mets as well. I was a little bit uncomfortable, having very, very limited television experience, about the stand-up at the beginning of the game. Mm-hmm. So I'd be standing with my first Islanders partner, Eddie Westfall, and I really had some questions and uncertainty about okay, am I looking at the camera? Am I looking at him? He's talking. Am I looking at him? Am I looking at the camera while he's talking? And they had a legendary broadcaster named Marty Glickman on staff at Sports Channel as a coach for all of the announcers, but he specialized in slugs like me who were making the midlife transition from radio to television. And I told him about that. And he said to me, just think of it this way. He says, that camera over there, that's the third person in a three-way conversation. So just imagine if you're my broadcast partner, I'm talking to you, and that's another person who's part of our little cocoon or conversation there. Yeah, you're going to steal a glance at him every once in a while, but I'm going to be focused on you. That one line made it crystal clear for me, and I never had a problem with that particular mechanic again.
This might be a difficult question to answer, but do you have one moment where you remember really falling in love with the Mets? I know they were new, I know, but do you have one moment as a kid where it went from this is a passion to this is it, this is everything?
I have one in mind, but it doesn't responsibly answer the question because it wasn't until 1966. Mm-hmm. Because if you go back to the very beginning, 1962 is the Mets' first year in the National League. I had started to follow baseball the year before because of my dad, who was a huge Yankee fan. And he took me to Yankee Stadium quite a bit in 1961, and that was the year that Mickey Mantle and Roger Maris had the great home run race trying to break Babe Ruth's record, as Maris eventually did on the last day of the season. I was so totally consumed by baseball, that's all I could think of once I became a fan. So now 1962 comes around, and there's this brand new team that's going to play in the National League. And me being the narcissistic little twerp that I was, I thought, well, isn't that nice? Now that I'm a baseball fan, there's a brand new team they made just for me, just so I can be a fan of that team. And that's kind of what happened. I adopted the Mets from day one. So when they played their first game in St. Louis on April the 11th, 1962, it was a night game. I had school the next day. I was only 8 years old. I couldn't stay up to watch or listen to the whole thing. So when I got up for school, I mean, I probably got up early because I was so excited to find out how the Mets did. My dad hadn't left for work yet. I ran into my parents' room. I said, what'd the Mets do? What'd the Mets do? My father said, they lost. And I felt it. I felt disappointed. And that was the beginning. But I guess maybe to answer your question with a little more clarity, although it's certainly not the moment that I knew how I felt about the Mets, it kind of was the confluence of not only, feeling my Metsdom, if you will, along with my desire to learn about and become a broadcaster. In August of '66, the Mets were playing the Giants at Shea Stadium. Juan Marichal, the great Giants right-hander, had a perfect game going for 5 2/3 innings. The Mets were losing 4-0 at the time. They'd never beaten Marichal yet. I mean, I don't know what he was, 10-0, 12-0, whatever he was against the Mets at that stage. So they're down 4-0 at the time. There's 2 out in the bottom of the 6th, and Marichal's got a perfect game going. So what does Wes Westrom, the Mets manager, do? He lets his pitcher, Dennis Rybant, hit. And that's when I knew I had a chance to become a sports talk show host, too, because I'm sitting in the upper deck with my friend going, what is this lunatic doing? They're down 4 runs. They haven't had a base runner, and he's letting Rybant hit, blah, 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 blah. Well, Dennis Rybant squirts a little 38 hopper through the middle for the Mets' first hit. Well, they would fall behind 5-0 in the 7th inning. And eventually they start chipping away, and they get Marichal out of the game, but they're still trailing going to the 9th inning. And with, I forgot how many outs there were in the 9th, but Ron Swoboda hit a pinch hit game-winning homer off of Bill Henry, a left-hander for the Giants. And I've never been so excited, or hadn't been to that point, by a sporting event in my life. And the whole ride home, we used to take the Q27 bus from where we lived in Bayside, Queens, to Main Street, Flushing, and vice versa to get home. And that whole way home on the Q27, all I could think of, along with how excited I was that A, this is the greatest baseball game I've ever seen in my life and ever will see. It's the greatest game in the history of the sport. But also, man, I wish, how did Bob Murphy make it sound? How did Lindsey Nelson make the home run sound? Everything kind of came together and coalesced that night into this dream, which I live to this day.
Were there any opportunities or offers that you had either to leave New York or that would have led you astray from the jobs that you ended up in?
Not really. And the only reason I hedge on that was because after I'd been established in New York, if I remember right, it was some of the people who, oh, you know what it was? Jeff Smulyan, who owned Emmis Broadcasting, eventually purchased the Seattle Mariners. And this is late 80s, early 90s, whatever. And I was on a Ranger road trip to Vancouver. And one of the people I knew from Emmis was also a big Ranger fan. He came down to Vancouver, or up to Vancouver, to see the game. And he made a point of spending a little time with me, and he said, look, you know, we own the Mariners now. You have any interest in thinking about maybe relocating to Seattle? He never made me an offer or anything. He was just taking my temperature. But, you know, at that point, I was doing the Rangers. I had Mets Extra and some odd Mets play-by-play on the side, and it wasn't going to happen. I was married by then, too, and I wasn't going to drag my wife out to Seattle. But that's the closest that I ever came, because I never pursued anything outside of New York. And I started working at WHN really soon after college, and established myself, at least to that extent, in New York, to where then I decided I didn't want to leave.
How was the process? What was the process of getting the Mets radio play-by-play job full-time when you replaced Bob Murphy after he left?
Yeah, it's interesting because it didn't necessarily have to happen that way. I was doing the Islanders, as you know, and I was doing what I had signed up for, half the Mets games on cable, which was Sports Channel back then. And then Cablevision had an option to go from 75 games to 100 my second year, and I was a little, oh boy, apprehensive about that, because that's a heavy workload, as you know. And so for a number of years, I'd say it was between 96 and 03, I was doing the Mets on TV, and eventually it became more than half the games. And then Gary Thorne, who was doing the over-the-air games, had conflicts with ESPN, and I'd fill in for him. So, you know, I was doing more than 100 Met games on TV. But all the while that I was doing television, as Bob Murphy was going through the final years of his career, I would get not so subtle messages from some of the higher-ups in the Mets organization that, you know, Bob Murphy is not going to be around forever, and just keep this in your mind. I mean, wouldn't it be cool for you and Gary, or wouldn't it be cool for you to, you know, step into that role and do it full-time as opposed to some of the games on TV? And, you know, what was I going to say? No, but, and I'll tell you something I've never told anybody in a minute. I really wasn't crazy about the idea, because I certainly wasn't going to give the Islanders up back then. I loved it, and I came to love everything about the Islanders. So that was huge for me, and doing half the Met games was a perfect fit. As that grew, it was with quite a bit of trepidation on my part about whether or not I could handle it. And I will admit that going from TV to radio at first was a little bit of a downer, but my producer and good friend, Kevin Meininger, who was the producer of the Islanders, said, hey, you know, when I had the opportunity to make the move full-time to radio with the Mets, he said, look, I know how you feel about the whole TV and radio thing, but it turned out to be the greatest thing that ever happened to Murph. And he said, this is a job you can retire in if all goes well. He said, these jobs don't grow on trees. You know, don't kid yourself. This is huge. Well, the part that I haven't ever told anybody before is that it was so daunting to me to consider that schedule. I almost didn't take it, and I talked to my agent about it. And you in particular will remember this, but that was the fall going into the winter of 03-04, when the noise was being made that there was going to be a lockout the following year in the NHL. And if that was going to be the case, we weren't going to get paid. So he said, well, what are you going to do? You're going to do a handful of games on television or whatever crumbs they would throw you there and not do any hockey? What were you going to do? So, okay, I took it and was excited about it once I set my mind to it. But, and this is the part that I've never spoken about before, we were in Los Angeles early in that 04 Mets season. The Islanders had just been knocked out of the playoffs by Tampa Bay. And I had gone straight out from, in fact, I think if I remember right, I flew home with the Islanders from Tampa, and the very next morning, like 3 hours later, got on a plane, met the Mets in Phoenix, and then we went on to LA. So consider that workload for a minute, and it's the first month I'm going to be doing every Met game, and I've got 5 months of the everyday grind in front of me. I was on the treadmill in the hotel we used to stay at in LA, the old Century Plaza, and while I'm on that treadmill, for about 60 to 120 seconds, I was going to leave the Mets. I said, I can't do this. I said, this isn't fair to my wife. I know about the money. I said, I can't do this to myself. I'm not going to have a life. And I started thinking while I was on the treadmill, you know, it's early enough in the day. Eddie Coleman's out here. You know, Gary at that, you know, he was the primary guy on radio. I was the number 2 guy. And so I honestly was making plans in my mind. Okay, when I finish this workout, I'm just going to go to a travel agent. I'm going to book a flight home. Eddie will pick this up, and they'll figure out the rest. I don't care. I can't do this. And before I got off the treadmill, I had a vision. I know this sounds corny. I know probably nobody is going to believe it. But my dad, who's been gone since 1978, he just came into my vision. And there was, it's not like I heard him say anything to me, but I could see him inferring to me that under no circumstances are you giving up what's a dream job. Don't you dare. And then I kind of had that moment where you slap yourself back to reality. And I said, all right, guess I'm working tonight, and the next night, and the next night, and the next night, and the next night. But I'm telling you, for probably 2 minutes that day on that treadmill, I was leaving the Mets. I couldn't do it.
We talked to Gary Cohen last year about the 2 years that you guys worked together in 04 and 05. And you know, he expressed how much he loved that, and it was like almost working with a mirror image of himself. How did you feel about working with him?
Well, I felt like, okay, I know these seats were seated in, but they should be wooden. They should be from Section 1 in the upper deck at Shea, because that's what it was like. Now, I'll get to the whole Gary thing in a moment, but you know, for me it was an adjustment. I wasn't used to being a number 2 guy, and I wasn't crazy about it, but it was the greatest blessing in the world because I was not ready to be a lead radio baseball play-by-play announcer. I didn't have the chops yet. And I've told Gary this, and I've said it in print interviews or on the air and to his face as well. I learned more about how to broadcast baseball on the radio in those 2 years with Gary than I did in any of the years before and have in any of the years since. It was just such an incredible education for me to watch not only his preparation and you know the enthusiasm, we shared that, but the passion, the same thing, but the attention to detail, how meticulous he was in his preparation and still is, and just to be able to watch a play unfold as he called it and pick up nuances that enabled me to become a much better broadcaster was an experience that has meant the world to me. And then you get into how great it was personally for just me and Gary to be working together. Or, sorry, English teachers, for Gary and I to be working together. Gary,
is that right?
I don't know. I told you, I'm 65, man. But you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, of course.
Those 2 years were such a blessing and such a learning experience and frankly, a gift.
Do you have a favorite call, a favorite moment?
In baseball.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was Johan's no-hitter until the one that just about cracked me up. My voice did break. When those words, the Mets win the pennant, came out of my mouth. You know, I grew up the worst schoolyard athlete you could imagine. So, you know, to be in the position where you're living the, quote, big league life anyway was so just against all odds. But when those words, the Mets win the pennant, came out of my mouth, and I mean, I used to call my own stickball games and my own punchball games, and it was always, you know, I'm the Mets and you're whoever you want to be or whatever else. It was always with that same goal to make that call. But that night in Chicago, when Jerry's Familia struck out Dexter Fowler, if you look and listen back now, you can hear my voice kind of separate itself from the chords a little bit. because it meant that much to me. It was that emotional.
Was that a natural reaction, or was in that moment, were the thoughts creeping into your mind already about those memories? Was all of it coming to you at once?
Yeah, they flood back in the abstract. I mean, I can't tell you that I saw any one particular moment at the schoolyard or image from my childhood. It's there, as I say, in this sort of balloon that you don't reach out and touch, but you feel. And I felt that almost overtake me as I was making the call. And I still have a welt on my upper right thigh because I had to squeeze so hard to keep from losing it a little bit. I mean, not like I would have been bawling like a baby, but I mean, come on now, this is a pretty important moment here, and people may listen to this some years down the road. Don't blow it by being a dope, you know, you're professional, right? But we all have emotions, and mine almost got the better of me with that call, and you know, there's still the one more call to come, and that's what I'm hanging on for.
Is that something that you need to do? I mean, outside of your control, you can't control if they win the World Series in the next 50 years, but is that something that you really need to put the cherry on top of your career?
Yeah. If they did it, I don't know that I'd even bother coming back the next year, because what would be the point? I mean, that would be it. And I know that when the Rangers won the Cup, that meant it was okay for me to leave whenever, if it was that next year. I mean, I worked one more year for the Rangers after they won the Cup, but I don't know if I ever could have left if they hadn't won. But I'm not staying around here forever if the Mets don't win the World Series, trust me. I'm hoping, I'm at the beginning of a long-term contract, and there'll be a lot of evaluation going on as we get towards the end of that, but I'm hoping that in that time span they can create that one moment that would complete my career.
Howie, you're the best. I know you wanted to have fun. Maybe it got a little more emotional than you thought it would, but this was fantastic.
Yeah.
Well,
we went 20-20 on you.
It's okay. I mean, look, you know, it's a kick. It's a kick for me to be with you guys, and I don't say that, and I'm completely serious now, because one of the things that Marv Albert did for me, as I explained, and he didn't do it by saying it, it was in his actions, which I've followed ever since, is that you get to a point in your life, and certainly in your career, where it's time to pay it forward. And I mean, Wayne has energized me so much this year, and you being here and us kidding around the way we do before games, after games, whatever, it's a gift to me. It keeps me young, and I love the opportunity now to help young broadcasters get better and to find their way. And there are a couple who will send me some clips on the internet, and I love listening to it, and I love giving them constructive criticism, because I had people do that for me. And it's, I think, a responsibility that we all have, and you guys are going to have many, many years down the road. But it's a wonderful feeling to know that you're able to help some guys, and I hope that that there are others in my generation who are doing that for you.
Well, it's noticeable, and it can be
Yes.
rare at times, and you know, I think you know we appreciate it, but in case you don't, we appreciate it.
Yeah,
We got it.
certainly do.
Howie Rose.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Howie.
All right, guys. Take care.